Good morning, everyone. I think it's probably appropriate for us to go ahead and get started. Shobna, can you do a quick check to confirm you can hear me? Or Gloria?
Yeah, we can hear you, Joshua.
Okay, good. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the sixth public workshop on the development of the Clean Mile Standard. We're excited to have everybody join us this morning. CARB continues to be committed to developing a comprehensive new program to help steer ride-hailing in an environmentally sustainable direction for California. Today's agenda will build on our July workshop and focus on our draft proposal showing our updated greenhouse gas and electrification targets and refined optional GHG credits for transit and active transportation. We're also releasing a draft of our actual regulation language for public comment before we finalize our proposal for the board. We appreciate the detailed comments we received from our July workshop and have carefully considered them as our analysis and proposed targets have evolved. There are a number of factors we have had to evaluate in finalizing our draft proposal. This includes the California Governor's executive order on zero-emission vehicles with an aggressive 2035 target for passenger vehicles. Additionally, both Lyft and Uber have publicly announced corporate commitments for aggressive sustainability and electrification actions through 2030. As is the case across our communities, there is a growing focus on equity and how policy decisions can help address disparities. Throughout our rulemaking process, we have kept a few key principles in mind related to equity. First and foremost, our analysis is grounding in a total cost of ownership framework where we evaluate the cost impacts of switching to a ride-hailing electric vehicle. We established a short payback period required before modeling an EV switch to reduce the impact on drivers. Our second principle related to equity was to include regulation provisions that encourage TNC partnerships with transit in the hopes that we reduce regional competition between the modes and enable transit to continue improving and providing services to lower income ridership. But in today's workshop, we'll take one additional step and propose an optional GHG credit that would specifically direct financial support to drivers. We continue to believe the ride-hailing industry will thrive in California. We see it as an important element in our transportation network, and we welcome stakeholder input on the structure of our regulations. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Gloria Pack and ask her to kick off the presentation.
Thanks, Joshua, and good morning. Welcome, everybody, to our sixth Clean Mile Standard workshop. Before we get started, let me go to the next slide here. Just some housekeeping notes. We want to let you know all participants will be muted during the workshop. During the Q&A session following the presentation, please type in your question using the questions function of the GoToWebinar. And questions can also be sent to the cleancars@arb.ca.gov email to be addressed at a later time. So today we'll be presenting some updates to our regulatory development for the Clean Mile Standard. We'll also be releasing the draft regulation order with the updated targets and optional credits. But so the new board hearing date, we'll be talking about that. We'll update you on our draft electrification targets, as well as our proposed draft greenhouse gas targets. So some background and basic information about SB 1014. The GHG target metric is in gram CO2 per passenger mile traveled. The electrification target is in the metric of % electric vehicle miles traveled. This program is applicable to passenger service only by transportation network companies, or TNCs. The key goals are to reduce GHG, to increase electrification, and to support other transportation modes. And to note here, this is, again, only applicable to passenger service, so no food or goods delivery is captured under this program. This is review for a lot of you, some SB 1014 deadlines. We've established the base year emissions inventory in January 2020. CARB staff released a white paper detailing the assumptions and methodology used for developing the base year inventory, which used data from calendar year 2018. CARB is required to adopt the Clean Mile Standard targets by January 2021 per SB 1014 deadlines. That's also when CPUC would implement the program. But due to additional analyses and evaluations being done, as you'll see in this workshop, the date to bring this regulatory proposal to our board has been pushed to May 2021. If that's delayed further, we'll post it on the Clean Mile Standard website. As for now, the TNCs must submit their GHG reduction plan every 2 years beginning on January 1st, 2022. And finally, the annual targets will begin in 2023. Once again, this program is unique in that the implementation and compliance tracking will actually be done by the Public Utilities Commission. And throughout the development of this regulation, we've been working quite closely with our counterparts at PUC, and they will also be conducting a separate regulatory process for the Clean Mile Standard. We'll be sharing more information about that as it becomes available with our stakeholders later this year. So the electrification targets are in the metric of percent electric vehicle miles traveled, or eVMT, and this includes the fraction of vehicle miles traveled by battery electric vehicles and fuel cell electric vehicles. So we have updates that were made to the input assumptions to the eVMT cost model since the July workshop. The BEV barrier is now $50 per week to $0 per week, $50 per week starting in 2020, and then decreasing linearly to $0 per week in 2030. The fuel cost forecast will be updated to reflect the Energy Commission's Demand Analysis Working Group updates to the 2019 IPER estimates. The update has a forecasted fuel price that is 15 to 20% lower than what was in the 2019 IPER. For annualized home level 2 charger costs, we have lengthened the amortization time period from 3 years to 7 years. And this was in response to stakeholder comments that chargers last approximately 7 years before they become obsolete or need replacing. The charging costs now reflect assumptions that the ratio of DC fast charging to level 2 home charging is fixed at 50 to 50 for all years of the analysis. Prior, the assumptions were that there was a transition to 90% DC fast charging by 2030. Also, in the updated assumptions, drivers with less than 5,000 miles per year in TNCs can now be switched to ZEVs. Here are the updated proposed electric vehicle miles traveled targets. In 2023, the eVMT target starts at 2% and reaches 90% by 2030 and onward. We're starting the eVMT targets in the first 2 compliance years at a manageable level and have a faster increase in later compliance years in response to stakeholder input. These characteristics of vehicles that switch to ZEVs in the cost model reflect the eVMT target of 90% by 2030. The model primarily switches the high TNC mileage vehicles to ZEVs in the early compliance years. And the average age of an ICE vehicle that the model switched to a ZEV was between 1 to 3 years old. By 2030, approximately 43% of TNC vehicles would be switched to ZEVs under the 90% eVMT target scenario. Here we're revisiting our compliance equation for the greenhouse gas targets. As directed by SB 1014, the target metric is grams CO2 per passenger mile traveled, or PMT. Components in this metric include total vehicle miles traveled and vehicle CO2 emission rate, or CO2 per mile in the numerator, and period 3 VMT and occupancy in the denominator. And for those who are new to the ride sourcing or app-based driving world, I'll briefly explain what the trip periods refer to. Period 1 are those miles where the TNC driver is logged onto the app and is waiting for a ride request. Period 2 are those miles where the TNC driver has accepted a ride request and is en route to the driver. And period 3 are those miles where the rider or riders have been picked up and are being driven to their destination. The updated proposed GHG targets are shown here both as the table on the right and the graph illustrating the curve of the targets compared to the business as usual gram CO2 per PMT. The GHG targets are closer to the 90% eVMT curve in the early years to allow time for the industry to implement compliance strategies such as adoption of electrification. The emissions and costs from the proposed GHG targets are modeled using a 100% eVMT scenario by 2030. This slide shows the gap in gram CO2 per PMT between the eVMT targets and the GHG targets over the compliance years. To illustrate the line graph from the previous slide further, the gap starts small in the early years to allow time for the industry to develop their compliance strategies. And please keep in mind, we have a provision to allow carrying forward of GHG credits for up to 3 years after they're earned, and those carry forward credits can be used to help close the gap between the eVMT and GHG compliance in the later years. In the next slides, we'll discuss the compliance options that can be used to close the gap or meet the GHG targets. The compliance options to fill the gap between eVMT and GHG targets include electrification, deadhead mile reduction, increasing shared or pooled rides, and optional credits, which we'll be discussing shortly. But we do want to note here that the optional credits cannot be banked or carried forward. Staff are proposing several optional credits that may be used towards GHG compliance. The first being investments in bikeway and sidewalks. The second, connecting passengers to mass transit. And the third, reducing driver costs to switch to a ZEV. The first optional credit we're proposing is investments in bikeway or sidewalk projects. To qualify, the project must be in an existing and approved plan of a local jurisdiction, and information including details of the project should be submitted in order to request this credit. The information required will be outlined in the draft regulation order that we'll release this month, and credits are earned over the project life for this option, and therefore the credits can be applied toward compliance in each year of the project life. And we'll discuss that further. Unused credits in 1 year actually cannot be carried forward. So again, optional credits cannot be banked. Calculating the CO2 credit for bikeway and sidewalk projects is done by taking the dollars invested multiplied by conversion factor of 907,185 for converting short tons to grams, and over $128 per ton CO2 multiplied by project life. The project life is the number of years the project will be operational, and the project years must be specified by the CEQA lead agency of the project. The second optional credit we're proposing is credit for connecting passengers to mass transit. In order to qualify for this credit, an integrated fare payment system must be used, where the passenger can purchase the TNC and mass transit fare in the same app or payment system. Appropriate data, such as trip data and connected transit agency, must be submitted. The data required will be listed in the draft regulation order we'll release this month. The amount of credit that can be earned with this option is simply the period 3 distance of the first or last mile connected vehicle trip, whichever is greater, using the vehicle CO2 factor. So as you can see in the equation, the CO2 credit amount equals period 3 VMT of the connected vehicle trip multiplied by the vehicle CO2 factor. We're seeking input on a third optional credit for which we have several concepts to share. The purpose of this optional credit is to help reduce the cost for TNC drivers to switch to a zero-emission vehicle. The first concept is GHG credits for dollars invested in ZEVs, which means subsidizing of a purchase or financing of a ZEV. This could also be used to subsidize ZEV short-term rentals. The second concept is GHG credits for electricity used by drivers. So CO2 credit can be earned for ZEV drivers based on proof of free electricity given from TNCs to drivers, for example, charging at a charging station. The third concept is GHG credits for level 2 home chargers. This means subsidizing the purchase and installation of home chargers. The optional CO2 credit would be applied to the GHG compliance equation as a term in the numerator. The CO2 credit amount would basically be deducted from the total mass CO2 for a particular fleet for a given compliance year. Our timeline for the regulation development has been updated, as mentioned before. This month, we will release the draft proposed regulation order. We expect the initial statement of reasons to be released in March 2021, and the regulation will be brought before our board in May of 2021. If there are any further changes to the board date, we will post it on the Clean Mile Standard website. So we are requesting stakeholder feedback on the topics we presented today, and we would appreciate if the comments are sent to us no later than December 11th to the cleancars@arb.ca.gov email address. And before we begin the Q&A session now, I'd like to remind everyone that all participants should be muted and questions should be typed into the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel. We will post the questions to the slides and read them aloud and have the appropriate staff address the questions. So if you'll give us a couple seconds here, we'll transition to the Q&A session.
So this is Joshua Cunningham. Sheldon, I understand we may have one or two. Oh, here we go. Would you like to have me start?
Sorry, I was muted, Joshua. I was going to read it out loud. I was muted.
Okay, go ahead, Gloria.
So the first question is, the incentives that you are describing in the webinar are applicable only to fleet of vehicles, meaning they cannot be applied to private persons who own their electric vehicles.
Yes, this is Joshua. I can answer this first question. I'm assuming this is referring to the option 3 credit that Gloria presented, which is our newer category. The answer is they can be applicable to privately owned vehicles as long as that driver owns or purchases that vehicle for the purpose of driving for Uber and Lyft. So the concepts that Gloria walked through, potential GHG credits for electricity subsidies from the TNC company, or a vehicle incentive from the TNC company, those both could go to a privately owned EV if that driver is working for the companies.
Okay, the second question is, will the CPUC begin to implement the program in January 2021, or will that date be moved to after the CARB Board Hearing in May? And for this, I can unmute Cody Naylor from the CPUC. If you give me 1 second. So Cody, you can, there we go.
Hi, good morning. My name is Cody Naylor. I'm the supervisor of the Commission's Transportation Analysis Section in the Consumer Protection and Enforcement Division. While we're aware of the delay in CARB bringing its regulation to its board in May, our plan has been to enable the Commission to make the most of 2021 in order to provide a forum to address the issues and implementation that the statute tasks the Commission with. I can't give you a hard and fast date because ultimately it's up to the Commission to decide when to open an order instituting rulemaking. But the target that we've set for ourselves is the early part of 2021, given the desire to have certain components of the program in place in time for the TNCs to submit their biennial plans by January 1st of 2022. So that's pretty much the plan. We plan to advance in the early part of next year, despite any kind of delay, rather than to say wait until after the board takes its action in May as currently planned. That's all I got. Thank you, though.
Okay, thanks, Cody. The third question we have is, with regard to the BEV barrier moving from $50 per week in 2020 to $0 per week in 2030, staff is assuming cost parity between BEV and ICE vehicles.
Joshua,
This is
is gonna
Joshua.
answer that.
Yes, thank you, Shobna. These are two separate assumptions in the cost analysis, but to answer the second part of that question, it is correct that we assume purchase cost parity between a battery electric vehicle and an ICE for the passenger car segment, so the smaller vehicle size, and for a battery electric vehicle driving range that we incorporated into our analysis, which was a 250-mile range. Larger vehicles like light trucks are in our analysis as well, although they're a smaller piece to the fleet. Their cost parity is further out. But for passenger cars, 250-mile range and less, yes, we assume cost parity before 2030.
Okay, next question. Can credits be earned for booking trips on micromobility? And I think I can take this one. It's a simple one. For now, we are not offering a credit for micromobility trips. The next question is, can you please show and discuss the slide from the potential credit, potential optional credit again? Okay, we'll go back.
Yeah, Gloria. Yeah, and when you go back to that, let's stop on option 3 because there's a lot of questions there. So
Okay.
if you want to start with 1 and 2, and then we'll stop at 3 again.
Okay. So again, the first option is investments in bikeway and sidewalk projects. And to clarify once more, the project life it needs to be determined by the local jurisdiction for which the project is under. And this project has to be already included in an existing and approved plan. So all of that information will need to be submitted to us in order to qualify for this credit. The second this is going back to the equation for how to calculate the CO2 credit. We may see some more questions about this. Once again, dollars invested multiplied by a tons to gram conversion factor over $128 times project life. And the $128 is a cost effectiveness value for bikeway and sidewalk infrastructure, and this is derived from cost effectiveness values for PM 2.5, CO and NOx from the FHWA, and emissions rates from the MFAC 2017 model. And the second optional credit, again, is connecting passengers to mass transit. And this must be done with an integrated fare payment system. The data submittal details, which you'll see in our draft regulation order, must include a lot of trip information for the first and or last mile vehicle connected trip, as well as the transit trip information. And the CO2 credit is a simple calculation of that VMT of the first or last mile connection multiplied by the CO2 factor for that trip for that vehicle. So this is our third optional credit that we're proposing for the first time today. And these are three concepts that we're proposing and would like feedback on.
Yeah, so let's go ahead, Gloria, to the questions. And I know there's a lot of questions on option 3.
Okay.
So if you want to go back to the questions, I can read the couple of questions there.
Sure.
Okay. So for option 3 credits, how would you treat trip-based incentives for driving ZEVs? For example, earnings per trip completed in a ZEV. So I think for the third option, I'm assuming that's option 3. So for those, I think what we're looking at is actually either payment towards a ZEV or subsidizing those payments or towards electricity or a level 2 charger. So would not, I think what we are thinking of is who would be eligible would be someone who is driving a certain number of miles, for example. So it would be based on a driver that drives, and we have not come up with X number of miles. So that's something that we're seeking input on as well. What would be a good, it should be at least a driver that drives, for example, 15,000, 20,000 miles per year or hours per week. What would be a good eligibility criteria? So that's something that we're still working out and we would like input on. Gloria, do you want to go to the next slide? Okay. Again, these are also still questions about option 3. How would you determine the number of CO2 credits under the program? And again, that credit, the option 3 is still something that we are working out and would like some input on. It would be related to, money invested and to a CO2 credit. So based on the information that they provide, there would also be some eligibility criteria. And those are things that we still need to work out and are seeking your input on. Subsidies towards drivers for financing, purchasing ZEV. can vehicle financing companies earn ZEV credits? The GHG credit can only be used for Clean Mile Standard or for other GHG-focused regulations. At this point, in the Clean Mile Standard, only TNC service providers can earn GHG credit because they are the ones who are subject to the GHG requirements. And at this point, we have, it would be within the Clean Mile Standard. I think in the future, we could look at other GHG-focused regulations, but for now, for the Clean Mile Standard, it would be only TNC companies earning the credit and using it for their compliance. Joshua, do you want to add anything more to that?
No, that's exactly how I would have said it too.
Okay. How are option 3 credits going to be funded? Will it be through the general fund, or are there other reliable revenue sources? So these credits, and it might not have been clear, and for the slide, Gloria, maybe we can go back to where or if it's basically, it will be in the GHG formula for the TNC companies. So they do not need to be funded. They are, it would be the TNCs, I guess, subsidizing the purchase or for charging or for the level 2 chargers, and they would be subsidizing it for their drivers. And then the credit that the TNC companies get for that, they would subtract from their GHG compliance formula here that's on the screen. So it would be within the same program that they would be earning the credits and using the credits. And in fact, it would be in the same year because these credits do not carry forward. So for example, if a TNC company were to subsidize provide free charging for 2023, they would earn credit in that year and use it for their compliance in the same calendar year, which is 2023.
Yeah, and Shobna, I'll add to that because it sounds like the question also is getting at whether the money flows to the state through the general fund, and the answer would be no. As Shobna is describing, the funding is a direct transfer between the TNC company and the driver. What we would require is some reporting evidence to us on the scale of the subsidy based on our limitations we put on the regulation. So some proof that the subsidy occurred for us to be able to then grant GHG credits.
Gloria, you can read the next one.
Sure. Okay, next question is, can you talk a little more in detail about the 3 options you're considering for driver cost credits and questions you're seeking input on? And I think we've kind of addressed this question with the other questions. So going back again once more to that slide, these are credits that we essentially CO2 credits to the TNCs that we are considering in order to reduce the cost for drivers switching to ZEVs to kind of try to reduce that barrier of switching to ZEVs, particularly for lower and moderate income drivers. So as Shobna mentioned, a lot of the details have yet to be worked out, but we definitely would like your comments and thoughts on the 3 options or the 3 concepts for option 3.
Yeah, and I'll add, Gloria, that we will likely want to narrow this down for our final proposal to the board. We may not have all 3 of these categories for option 3. So we would like input on which one stakeholders feel is the most supportive of drivers. Clearly, one of the earlier questions got at the issue of what is the GHG credit value. That's something that we could use input on, like Gloria noted earlier. And third, I'd like to just make sure that it's clear that these are GHG credits that would reduce the overall effectiveness in terms of the GHG benefits to the program. So we want to make sure we're providing an option here that is supporting of drivers, but in that overall trade-off context.
Okay, next question. TNCs must submit GHG reduction plans in 2022. When do they need to start submitting emissions data? So the program implementation, or the targets actually begin in 2023. So we are proposing that for calendar year 2023, TNCs must submit an annual compliance plan the following year, March of 2024, summarizing their GHG and electrification compliance. And as far as the data submittal, that may coincide with the annual compliance summary, and those details will be worked out with the CPUC as well, because I know that currently the data submittal is on a slightly different schedule. It's not necessarily January to December. I believe it's something like covering the period of August through July or September through August, and the data submittal is currently due in September. So we will write it into the draft regulation order when exactly the data submittals and the report submittals are due. Next question is, what are the plans from CARB CPUC to conduct real-world audits to ensure that regulated parties are submitting compliance data that reflects the reality on the ground?
And I can take that one, and maybe if you can unmute Cody as well. So, you know, as far as auditing, I think that's something that, I guess, just a couple of things on data auditing. So I think what we will be doing is, you know, checking, for example, TNC companies will be submitting line by trip data, and we'll be, you know, looking at that. I'm not sure how to get to, you know, I guess real world audits in the sense of like, was this passenger picked up at this time and dropped off at this time, and this is the distance that they traveled. I think we have made it very, you know, when we've talked to stakeholders, we would love to get your ideas on how that could happen. I think that would be, you know, I'm not sure how we would be able to do that. And Cody, I don't know if you want to add anything more from CPUC.
Cody's audio may not be working right now. I'm not able to unmute him. But if someone else from CPUC working on the data side would like to chime in, but we may have to come back to this question at a later time.
Yeah. Okay, let's go to the next one, Gloria.
Question 12. What is the BEV barrier? What is the implication of the change in this assumption and others on EV adoption? Have these assumptions been updated to reflect required charging or unpaid time?
So Joshua is going to answer that. I think, you know, we've used BEV barriers just in general terms. It could be a lot of different things. And I don't know, Joshua, if you want to add anything more to that.
Yeah, I'll start by saying that this is an important question. The BEV barrier topic is something we've addressed in at least the May workshop, possibly the July workshop as well. So if anybody would like to go back and look at those staff presentations from our website, that can help. But as Shobna noted, the BEV barrier was a variable we have in our cost analysis that is meant to reflect some of the market challenges for a driver making the switch to an EV, whether it be related to outreach information or information that they don't have in making the choice, or it could be related to the time value or having to refuel their car. Our assumption of making the BEV barrier 0 by 2030 is reflective of the assumption that we believe many of these challenges will be addressed by that point.
Okay, thank you, Joshua. Next question is, Why is micromobility excluded when bike lane and infrastructure is prioritized?
Yeah, and Gloria, you can probably add more to this, or if Nicole is online, but I think because we're looking at infrastructure projects, which are basically on road, right, for either sidewalk or bike paths, and I think micromobility would be covered under that. I don't see it being a separate infrastructure project. So I don't think it's necessarily excluding them. It's just, you know, on a bike path, you can have micromobility, and even on a sidewalk, right? So I think they would be covered. But anything else to add there, Nicole or Joshua?
I'll add that, yeah, we in the past have considered a micromobility credit, and we've kind of whittled down our options to bike lane and sidewalk infrastructure, which supports micromobility and active transportation. So like Shobna said, it's not necessarily that we are excluding micromobility. We expect that these infrastructure projects already support micromobility, so a separate credit for micromobility trips may not be necessary at this point.
Yeah, and Gloria Nicole is sending a note that she generally agrees with that, but we may need to elevate her to a panel member to answer future questions.
Okay. Should I unmute her?
If you can, yeah.
Okay, Nicole, you've been unmuted, or you can unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. No, I think Shobna covered the answer well, but I appreciate being able to speak if necessary for future questions.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, will the targets be applied to the CPUC's AV deployment permit program, which the Commission is considering approving today?
I'll start by answering that, but I think we should have Cody jump on as well. Our targets are specific to the Clean Mile Standard regulation that we're proposing to our board and that the PUC will implement per SB 1014. We do note in our staff analysis and the regulation order that if there is an automated vehicle that is providing ride-hailing services for passengers and that meet the criteria of our rule, that fleet operator would likely fall under the scope of our regulation. But that is separate from the PUC's AV permit program. And I would welcome Cody to elaborate. He may not be available, so I believe I covered it, but we would need him to help answer specifics about the PUC's separate AV permit program.
Yeah, if we can get Cody's audio back at a later time, we may be able to address these questions. The next question is, why does the connection to transit option give credit for the entire trip to or from transit? The length of the connection to transit isn't necessarily related to the amount of CO2 equivalent avoided by the transit trip. Additionally, many of these first last mile trips likely would otherwise be taken by walking or biking, so the TNC trip actually increases emissions. And for this, I will unmute Nicole again. In the meantime, if somebody else would like to address it.
Yeah, I mean, to your note about, you know, would the trip be already taken by walking or biking? And yes, that will occur potentially to a degree, but we find the value of promoting transit to be a worthy one. And the more that we can get folks to perhaps not take the entire TNC or their entire trip in a TNC, but rather connect to the transit system. That's a valuable thing. But if you guys have suggestions about what other measure or metric that we should use for that credit, we're all ears.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. The next question is, what will happen if there are barriers outside of TNC's control, for example, insufficient BEVs available, that prevent TNCs from meeting their electrification and/or GHG targets?
And Gloria, I can start there, and maybe Joshua can also add. I think in general, we have not in the past done kind of a, a provision where if you were to meet these conditions, then the standards wouldn't apply, for example. But in every rule, when we're implementing any rule, if there are unforeseen circumstances or emergencies that come up, which are legitimate and will hinder the compliance, I think you can always reach out to the implementation agency, which would be CPUC in this one, and ask for a waiver. And I think that's how we would probably like to deal with it. We don't, obviously, it would be an emergency if that happens, because at this point we do see that there will be enough zero emission vehicles available to meet the standard as the TNC fleet stands. So I don't know, Joshua, if you want to add anything more to that.
No, you answered that really well, Shobna.
Okay, thank you. Yep, next question. What % of total light-duty vehicle or transportation GHG does staff estimate trips on TNCs will represent in 2030 in a do-nothing baseline? If all of TNC GHG were driven to zero via CMS, how does that total cost of GHG abatement, that is cost of net new incentives available to TNC drivers, compare to other light-duty vehicle abatement programs run by CARB, for example, CVRP costs to ZEV mandate, benefit, etc.?
I can take a first cut at this, but we will not have all the information here to answer it today. In our April workshop, I think is when we did our baseline projections for the TNC fleet for our rulemaking. I would welcome any stakeholder to go back and look at that staff presentation. Gloria or Kathy or others can correct me, but I believe a no CMS baseline projection in 2030 showed that, let me get the exact metric being asked here. If all the TNCGs were driven, no, staff estimate trips. I'm not going to know the trip number off the top of my head. I recall the proportion of EVs in a do-nothing is on the scale of 4 or 5% of the TNC fleet. I recall the proportion of, in 2018. I don't think we're going to have the answer to this off the top of our heads right now. What I related to the first half of the question, so we can try and we can dig this up and provide information offline. What I do know is that the second half of the question we will not have answers to. We have not done any analysis to compare the scale of the GHG reductions in our program related to abatement of emissions from incentive programs. We do have in our SRIA documentation, though, and in our future staff analysis coming out with the staff report, we will show the GHG emission reductions from our program. And so any stakeholder could compare that to other programs, but we will not be doing that directly in our formal staff documents.
Okay, thanks, Joshua. Next question. Go ahead.
And before we move on, Gloria, I'm just looking at a note that came in from our team members here. Yeah, so I think we'll have to answer this offline after we do a bit more homework.
Okay.
So go ahead, Gloria, with the next one.
Next question is, would CPUC or CARB be charged with reviewing eligibility for optional credits? And I believe this for the optional credits, it will be CARB will have a role in reviewing the eligibility or qualification, as well as approving the optional credits. Somebody can correct me if I'm
Yeah,
misstating it.
that's correct. That's correct, Gloria. So CARB will be in charge of reviewing and determining the credits and providing that to CPUC.
Yeah. Next question is, could you describe how optional credit 3 may interact, support, or conflict with reporting facilities LCFS credits for ZEV capacity investments?
I can take this. Yeah, I'm familiar with the low carbon fuel standard. They have ZEV infrastructure credits that are based on the capacity of hydrogen stations or DC fast chargers. Our optional credit, if we move forward with it, would be completely separate from that. The intent of our proposed credit would be that if a TNC is showing some financial commitment towards a home charger for a driver, that we would grant them a GHG credit. So that would be completely separate from an LCFS credit for either a public charger or their rebates to homeowners for home charging. It would be separate.
Okay, thanks, Joshua. Next question is, have you done a back of the envelope calculation of how much dollars to bike projects would be required to quote unquote fill the gap?
Yeah, and I can take that. And we have not done that because for some of the options like option 3, we have not necessarily figured out exactly what the CO2 credit would be. I would say in general, that's something that we will work out in the next month here. But one of the things that, is good to know is those, the credits for option 3 will not carry over year from year. So even if they are earning a lot of credits for that year, it has to be used in that year. So Joshua, do you want to add anything else to that?
No.
Okay, moving on to the next question. Have you thought about directing revenue to Clean Cars for All? Based on our research, TNC drivers are predominantly low income and could benefit from CCFA while furthering the goal of the Clean Miles standard.
We are very much aware of some of the other incentive programs. We certainly hope that the TNC companies help provide information to their drivers for the drivers to be able to take advantage of other state incentive programs. Our proposed option 3 would be separate. The intent of our proposed concept, our proposed option, would be to have CMS itself provide additional financial certainty for drivers to help them with the switch to either an EV vehicle or the EV fuel. So ours would be within our program, recognizing that there could be barriers for switching, but we certainly would encourage those drivers and the TNC companies to provide outreach to the drivers for other public funds separate from our program.
Okay, next question is, it seems like the option 3 credits are mostly private spending and private gain with only marginal public benefit. Have you considered investment in EV infrastructure with wider public benefit?
Yeah, I'll take this, Gloria. As we've mentioned before, what we are exploring with option 3 is a TNC company financial subsidy in some form to their drivers directly. And our hope in that is to make sure that we're seeing with reporting to us before we grant that GHG credit, that we see some evidence that there is some more direct financial support for the drivers. And the reason we're really considering this option is that we recognize that a lot of drivers are under financial strain, and we wanted to we are exploring an option here in CMS to have more certainty that there is a financial support for drivers directly within our program. But we recognize and hope that other programs, whether it be public charging investments by varying private companies, can be used by the drivers. So we're not trying to compete or complement those separate efforts.
Okay, next question is, if driver cost subsidy GHG credit is limited to TNC entities only, there could be a concern that TNC drivers are forced to rely upon TNC programs versus other programs that vehicle financing companies can offer. Thus, would it be better to allow vehicle financing companies to earn these clean mile GHG credits?
Yeah, and those, thank you for that comment. And I think we would love to hear from you on the option 3 that we've presented today, because I think we do have to think through it. I think it would be hard to bring in another entity to earn credits, but we can definitely look at that. I think it would be, I think TNC programs that offer financing to the drivers, they would have to be very competitive for the drivers to go with them, right? So there are other financing programs that are incentive team. Like CARB also has, for CVRP, I know they're thinking of a vehicle financing program. So to me, if the TNC company is getting credit, they actually would be also making those programs very competitive for the drivers. But if you think that would work the opposite way, we'd love to hear those thoughts.
Okay, next question. On slide 17, option 2, isn't the credit calculation providing greater credits for trips in higher emitting vehicles? This seems counter to the goals of the regulation. This may be a question for Nicole, and I can add to it if needed.
While Nicole's coming online, Gloria, is that referring to the CO2 factor in that? Do we think it's related to the CO2 factor in that equation for option 2? That's the integrated fare credit.
Yeah, I think to clarify, what we are doing with option 2 is we're calculating the CO2 credit based on the vehicle miles versus, let's say, the transit miles. And a reason for calculating this credit based on the vehicle miles is because we will not get trip data for the transit mile, and also we want to be careful that we're not overextending the credit to mass transit miles that are extremely high, let's say hundreds of miles, as a credit. I believe Nicole is unmuted if you'd like to add to this response.
No, I think what you're saying is absolutely right. I mentioned this a little earlier, but the idea is that we're trying to incentivize these trips to, instead of happening in a TNC alone, to have a portion or the majority of that trip occur via transit. And so the idea isn't to incentivize higher emitting vehicles from the perspective of like, oh, the dirtier vehicle, the more credit, but the concept is the more that we can get people out of vehicles, especially the dirtier ones, and onto transit, the better.
Thanks, Nicole.
Mhm.
If no one has anything to add to that one, I'll move on to the next question. So next question is, how is, I think they mean P1 or period 1 determined if driver is waiting with more than one TNC at a time, which I heard was permissible. Yes, that is true. The period 1 will be logged for multiple apps if that driver is logged onto multiple apps and is waiting for a ping in period 1. So the way we're calculating compliance is that each company reports all of their period 1s, whether or not the driver was on a different app at the same time. Someone else may want to add to this, possibly, to clarify.
Yeah, Gloria, that's correct. I'll just note that during our 2018 base year analysis, we did recognize there is some overlap, and we quantified that for the 2018 base year. But as Gloria noted, for the actual implementation of the rule, it's only feasible for us to require the companies to be able to track their own P1 and not look at the potential overlap. So they're going to be required to comply and report to their own P1 emissions and miles.
Next question is, in previous workshops, active or public transit PMT were included in the denominator of the GHG target. Can you please discuss the reasoning for this change to the GHG target calculation? And I can start this off. The reason why we converted what we call the zero emission or ZPMT into a CO2 credit instead is that now we have a GHG target of 0 grams CO2 per PMT by 2030, and having a value in the numerator remaining while the denominator, let's say, is increased by the amount of ZPMT the math would not work out such that that TNC could reach 0 grams CO2 per PMT. So that's part of the reasoning why we converted the credit to a gram CO2 that can be deducted from their fleet-wide mass CO2 for a calendar year.
And Gloria, I'll just add that while the metric has changed, the quantification methodology that we used the last time is the same now. It's just a different metric. So there hasn't been any changes to the methodology.
Yep, thanks, Nicole. Next question. So what net new incentives will be available from the state for drivers, especially low income, and riders to use to overcome initial market barriers, or are TNCs expected to cover all of that?
I'll take this. We continue to hope that the TNC drivers take advantage of existing state and federal incentives for EVs, and we can imagine that some of those programs can evolve to better support TNC drivers. So what we are proposing is separate from that, and the option 3 that we proposed would be a GHG credit that would benefit the TNC companies in their compliance if they are showing that they're providing some direct financial support for the drivers. So we recognize that that is separate from these other incentive programs that we hope are available, but it is a way that we're hoping to, in our rule, see some direct support to drivers financially. And it's an option for the TNC companies as we propose, so it would be a GHG benefit that is given to the TNC companies for their GHG compliance.
Next question is, given current conditions, does your EV switching model accurately predict drivers who have already switched to EVs in your baseline data set?
Yeah, I don't know if you can unmute Kathy, Gloria, but yes, I think it's, you know, our baseline does have the base year, I guess, ZEV adoption in the California fleet. So it should have, without the regulation, how many people would have switched to ZEVs would be part of the model.
Yep, Kathy, if you'd like to add, or sorry, go ahead, Nicole.
Thanks. This is Nicole. Maybe some clarification on the question. When I read that, I view it as, have we checked the cost model predictions against the baseline inventory? And does the cost model predict the switches that we're seeing in the baseline? And if that is the question, we'll need a little bit more time to loop back with our economist. But if the person who asked that question can clarify that, that would be helpful.
Okay, Kathy, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can, if you have anything to add. Otherwise, I can move to the next question. Okay, I will move on to the next. Oh, go ahead, Kathy.
I think Shobana is correct. In the baseline scenario, we assume that the the penetration of EV is the same rate as what's assumed in MFAC 2017.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, how are you defining fare integration in the TNC to transit option? And I probably will tag Nicole for this.
So fare integration, and so I'll describe it conceptually, but I know we're working out the details of that in the regulation order. But the idea is an app that connects the fares, or someone can purchase a transit fare through an integrated app. And I'll mention one that the California Integrated Fare Program that Caltrans is running, that kind of integrated fare program where folks can move from one mobility service to another and purchase that fare.
And I think this question may have been actually expanded to what's shown below. It's clear that the transit credit would allow TNCs to claim credit for trips connecting to transit, but how does this encourage trips to connect to transit? And to the earlier commenter's credit, even that does not establish a reduction in emissions.
The idea is that if we create if we're creating an incentive that the TNCs can get credit for this type of option under the regulation, that they'll be incentivized to partner with the transit agencies and to develop apps that connect their riders to transit. In which case it would be moving people from a TNC trip, which they would take, to one that is a shorter TNC trip connected to transit, which has a net reduction.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Under the new GHG targets, how will TNC GHG emissions intensity compare to that of the average California personal fleet over the next decade? Starting point was about 50% higher as reported in CARB's 2018 base year emissions inventory report.
Yeah, and Gloria, you can actually go back to the slide if it's easier on the GHG targets. It does have our baseline line on there, just to compare it. And those slides will also be posted, just reiterating that they'll be posted by either today or tomorrow. So as you can see there, we have the baseline in gray, and then our targets are in blue. You can probably move to the next question, Gloria.
Okay, next question Excluding micromobility could have negative equity impacts, particularly in places like Oakland. And I will start by saying that our intention is not to exclude micromobility, but that by supporting newer or improved bikeway and sidewalk infrastructure, we would actually be supporting micromobility and active transport such as walking. So with that credit, we are hoping that those negative equity impacts would be mitigated. If Nicole would like to add anything to that.
No, nothing to add. Thanks, Gloria.
Okay, next question. Following up on an earlier question about automated TNCs, would a new provider doing only automated trips be exempt from requirements under the small TNC exemption discussed in previous workshops? Or would you consider making them subject to the CMS requirements regardless of size, given the large potential for negative GHG impacts from AVs and lack of issue of costs of electrification being passed to drivers?
I can take this, Gloria. I think an automated operator providing ride-hailing passenger services would be subject to the same requirements as a driver-based TNC company. The small TNC provision we have in our proposed rule is based on a total VMT for that company per year. So if an automated TNC company crosses over that threshold, they become subject to CMS just like a driver-based program. And we set that threshold such that automated or driver-based programs, if they go across that threshold, then those companies have started to create tangible GHG implications. But if they're below that threshold, we think it would be would not have large GHG impacts in California.
Okay, moving on to the next question. This is a long one. Low-income and middle-income drivers need the regulation to strongly push companies through direct requirements, ideally, or credit structure to absorb the incremental cost of BEV adoption. How will the 3 driver options push the TNCs to absorb adoption costs of vehicles? How can you strengthen the proposals presented to ensure that companies absorb all or the majority of the incremental cost of vehicles for low, moderate, and middle-income drivers?
Yeah, and Joshua can add more to this, but I would just say that, we definitely are open to ideas here. I think it's, we do have certain authority. So for that question, I think the short answer, which Reed is telling me here, is that we cannot. And it is definitely difficult. And, so I think the credits that we have are an attempt to get there, to at least incentivize the TNC companies taking on the cost to the drivers and therefore earning some GHG credits. I think it would have to be a requirement that we don't have authority for here. If we were to have a requirement where the TNC companies would pay for the cost of the ZEVs. So I don't know, Joshua, if you want to add more to that.
I do not, but if you want to unmute Reed, if that's possible, he could elaborate. And while
I think Reed can unmute himself.
Okay, yeah, I think I'm unmuted now. So
yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. So SB 1014 doesn't give CARB any specific authority to require that the TNCs take on all the costs of the regulation, or keep all the drivers from absorbing some of the costs. We would like them to take on the costs, but that's our authority is somewhat limited when it comes to how the TNCs are passing along the costs, how they're setting rates. I will say that the California Public Utilities Commission does have a bit more authority when it comes to addressing rates with the TNCs, but I'll let them speak to their specific authority with regard to this sort of question.
Let's keep going, Gloria.
Next question, if a driver receives an option 3 credit from the TNC they work for, doesn't that obligate them to continue working for that company even if they want to quit or change jobs? What obligation does a driver have to the TNC if they take the credit?
Yeah, and I can just start here that, this is a new option that we've been thinking through and would like feedback on. I think we do want to have some reporting requirements here and eligibility criteria. So yes, I think it's something that we want to talk through and have. I think we could probably limit what companies are getting credits and what they need to have, but contract-wise, what the TNC company has with the driver, I don't know if we can necessarily, dictate that.
This is Reed again. I guess I would add to that we could definitely consider whether we should have additional restrictions on awarding credits based on that sort of thing. But I think in general, we would be cautious and conservative about attempting to dictate what the TNCs are doing with regard to contracting with their drivers.
Okay, next question. What's the ratio of CARB's expectation to credit from base target versus all 3 options? The ratio guideline is important for auto manufacturers to estimate BEV volume per year.
I can start this and then Shobna or Kathy can add. As Gloria noted in the presentation, any of these options, whether it be the integrated fare, the bike infrastructure, or the third one with financial support, all of them would only be available for use within the GHG credit for the gap between the GHG compliance and the GHG emissions coming from the eVMT. So in terms of auto manufacturers estimating demand for their cars, they can at least count on the amount of EVs needed to meet the eVMT requirement in CMS. And our staff analysis will clearly show to meet the 90% eVMT target in 2030 will outline exactly how many EVs that is estimated to be.
Yeah, and just to add really quick to that, for new vehicle requirements fall under Advanced Clean Cars 2. So that is a rulemaking that will also happen in the next few years here. So I don't think this regulation is pushing, new vehicle sales for BEVs necessarily. What we assumed in our baseline is with Advanced Clean Cars 1 on the books today, there are enough vehicles that will be on the California fleet to meet this requirement. So I guess I don't look at it as an additional requirement for new vehicle sales.
Next question is, why does the connection to transit option give credit for the entire trip to or from transit? The length of the connection to transit isn't necessarily related to the amount of CO2 equivalent avoided by the transit trip. Additionally, many of these first last mile trips likely would otherwise be taken by walking or so this is kind of a repeat of a question we had earlier. And
Gloria,
go ahead, Nicole.
And clarify that I think a few of the commenters are thinking through this in terms of a different baseline, meaning like when you look at the world without TNCs versus looking at the world with TNCs, and the emissions benefits that we look at, or the emissions impacts that we look at when it comes to a regulation like this, is what happens in the absence of the regulations, which in this case is the existence of TNCs, versus what happens with the regulation. Without the regulation, we will have folks taking TNC trips that could be taken with transit or could be taken by foot. The purpose of this credit is to move some of those trips that would have been taken entirely by TNC to partially or nearly entirely by transit. And that's where the benefit comes from. And so you have to look at it as a TNC trip that someone maybe took from, let's just say, you know, city A to city B, that's 10 miles. Now they're taking a TNC trip that's only 1 mile and then taking the last 9 miles of that that's on transit. Now it's difficult for us to know what that entire trip is. And so the metric that we chose was the P3 portion. But if you guys have recommendations on what that trip length metric should be, we would be happy to take those suggestions or hear you out. But I know it's a little bit different than looking at the world in the absence of TNCs, but that's not the way that we look at impacts when we're assessing a regulation.
Thanks, Nicole. Moving on to the next question. Would it be possible to only apply the transit connection credit when the ride originates or ends for last mile in an area that is not served by existing transit in order to avoid people using TNCs in place of a transit connection?
This is Nicole. I'm going to read this again just so I can follow it and then answer it. So would it be possible to only apply the transit connection credit when the ride originates ends in an area that is not served by existing transit in order to avoid people using TNCs in place of a transit connection? So the transit credit can be used wherever the ride originates. Oh, but you're saying ends in an area. I would like to hear, regarding this question, any specific thoughts on what you mean by that. It feels like what you're trying to get at are potentially incentivizing trips for folks where there aren't transit options, but ensuring that those mobility options or mobility needs are served. But if you could elaborate more or provide a little bit more detail in your comments, that would be really appreciated.
Okay, and then the next question is another one for you, Nicole. It says, I would like more detail on the GHG credit for the transit option. It does seem to provide higher credit for vehicles with high CO2 factor, as an earlier comment noted.
Yes, so the model year of the vehicle matters, but again, so imagine you're talking about an older vehicle that emits higher, that's taking a 10-mile trip with that person. We're now, the idea is that TNC trip is reduced to something less than that, and is replaced by transit. And so yes, the more that we can get people out of those higher emitting cars and onto transit, the more of a benefit that provides than if they were in a clean vehicle.
Okay, next question. Does short-term rental include companies providing EV car sharing?
And I can take that. At this point, it does not, but I guess we can definitely look into that, and we would love to hear your thoughts on what the reporting would look like on that. So yeah, I think that's something that we are open to. I think the idea is to subsidize the zero emission vehicle. So we can definitely look into that, and would like to hear some more, feedback on that. Okay, I'll go to the next question unless somebody wants to add anything. Give Gloria a break here because she's been talking a lot. This presentation did not include any details about pooled ride requirements. Is that component no longer part of the proposal? And it is still part of the proposal as far as as far as compliance. The TNC companies will be reporting trip-by-trip data, which will also include their occupancy values. So we can definitely look at that data to see how that changes over time. And there is the pooling, I guess, is part of the gap that we keep talking about, which is the gap between the eVMT target and the GHG target. So pooling, increased pooling can be a compliance option for TNC companies. So I think that's where increased in pooling would help TNC companies meet the GHG target. So that's the compliance option that pooling comes into play. Let's go to the next slide, Gloria.
Sure, and I just want to add real quick regarding the pooling. If you think back to the GHG compliance equation, the occupancy value is reported and incorporated into the denominator of the equation. So the more you increase pool rides, in other words, the higher your occupancy, your average occupancy, the lower your GHG per PMT. Moving on to the next question.
Let me.
You want to go
I'll
ahead?
give you a break. I'll give you a break for a minute, Gloria. We have a few more questions here. So with the 90% electrification target, what amount of vehicle turnover do you assume will have to occur? And I think we had that on one of the slides. It was about 43% in 2030. Have you considered the life cycle emissions impact and potential waste impact of having to replace an ICE vehicle that have not reached the end of their useful life? And I would say the way that we look at switching vehicles is that they are, because this is an in-use regulation, they are still part of the California fleet. So the ICE vehicle that is being replaced by a ZEV would still be part of the California fleet. It would be someone else who buys that. So it's actually almost switching a vehicle from a TNC driver to a non-TNC driver in the California fleet. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add to that. Okay. I think that's all the questions that we had. I know there were some questions about, which I didn't post on here, about just feedback by the 11th and the draft regulation order. We were hoping to get our slides posted today, but it didn't happen. But it will, by the end of this week or early next week, our slides and our reg proposal will be, the draft regulation will be posted, and we would love to get some comments back on that. I know that some people had, I think, a few more questions on the transit connections, and I think it might be better to reach out to us separately on that and send us an email at the Clean Cars email address, and we can try to clarify, because I think it's a little bit harder on some of these comments going back and forth because we can't unmute everybody. So I would just say, I think there were a couple more comments on the transit piece, and I would love if you could just give us an email on the Clean Cars email address, and we can get back to you on that. And I want to make sure that we cover the question and answer correctly. I think that was the last question. Let me just check one more thing here. Okay. Anything else that I just want to thank everybody for coming to this workshop, and I think we have had a lot of interest in these credits, so we're happy to clarify anything, and we look forward to your comments on the new options that we provided today, or anything else that you would like to comment on for this proposal. We should have the reg proposal out, and I think it would be very useful to go through that and let us know especially on the reporting requirements for some of these credits, if you have additional input. Joshua, do you want to add anything else?
No, you've captured, well, I mean, I will add a little bit, but you've captured most of it. Thank you. I'll just add to what Shobna noted about the regulation order. This will be the first time we release our draft regulation language and would really appreciate scrutiny by stakeholders. I also want to just mention for anybody who is new to this workshop, you can go to our website and see the workshop presentations from the prior events. I would encourage anybody to do that to gather more background. But overall, thank you everyone for participating today. This was our 6th public workshop. We are near the end of our rule development. We're feeling good about the process and the stakeholder engagement we've had at this point, and I appreciate the questions today. So thank you, everybody.